is I, Countess Naravan Dracovin, Lord and Emperor of the Dracovin Empire, and welcome. It is time to continue my discussion on the various campaign settings that have been introduced since Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, and of course, where I started off, Spelljammer. Dungeons & Dragons adventures in space. So let's continue where we left off. I was talking about what you need to do to adapt a character from a normal Dungeons & Dragons game to a spacefaring game. There are some things about classes that you're going to have to know about, so let's talk about them first. Now, a fighter. You don't actually have to do a lot for a fighter. Fighters' abilities tend to work perfectly fine in space. In fact, fighters are one of the classes that are more likely going to have a lot of the abilities, using ranged weapons, or using large weapons like ballistas or catapults. They're more likely to know that sort of thing. Now, there are some limiting factors, especially in older editions or certain editions where you could gain followers, even as a fighter. This applies to anything you can get a fighter with. The kind of followers you can find are different in space. Of course, you're not going to find the same kind of people to follow you around should you gain the ability to gain followers in space. The exception, too, is you're going to need to have some kind of stronghold in order to gain them, some kind of base of operations. Whether it's a formerly abandoned asteroid or something else entirely, you're going to have to figure out having some kind of base of operations that's more space-based, and then you can start building up whatever group of followers would match it. And again, as I said, this does apply very much so for AD&D version of fighter, but in other editions where other characters could possibly have followers, it works the same. Now, the Paladin. The Paladin is a mixed bag, I'm going to say, about abilities it can have in space. Just by principle, most of what it can do, swing a sword, stab something, it can do in space. Though it is oftentimes granted its power from some kind of divine source, it doesn't lose that connection just by traveling to different spheres and stuff. It does have some limitations, though, that it might not gain the full sweep of its powers as it travels. For one thing, when you're not within a sphere where your deity exists, you can't learn spells. You can't memorize spells the same way because you do not have that divine connection. Granted, if you're in one of these spheres, you could use the contact home power or a priest icon in order to make this connection to your home plane and allow yourself to effectively cast the spells. So there is a way around it. Also, it is important to note when you're in the Phlogiston, you cannot do this at all. Of course, you never can when you're in the area, the Rainbow's Ocean itself. Now, other powers are limited if you are in a plane which your deity is not native to it. For one thing, any kind of detection abilities you have are limited to 30 feet. Any kind of auras you create are limited to 5 feet. Any kind of healing abilities or curing abilities that you have don't work. They are directly given from the divine source that you worship. Any sort of other ability you have, unaffected. And any kind of ability you have to fight against things like undead are also not affected. That is important to note, too. So, certain uses of your divine abilities might not function, while some ways you can still draw upon your divine powers. It's an interesting mixture of them, depending on where you are, and of course, in the universe. Now, a ranger, in and of itself, is also relatively unaffected. The majority of a ranger's abilities, not affected. The exception is their spells. They come from a divine source. Now, granted, it's not from a deity per se, but usually the worship of some kind of natural energy. The thing about this is they are also unable to rememorize their spells within the Phlogiston. And they also have trouble when they reach a plane a sphere that they are unfamiliar with and not native to. They will have to either come up with the same sort of spells or icons as the Paladin, or eventually they should be able to form a bond with the nature of this sphere and able to once again regain their spells, but require a process to do in order to do this. Other than their spells, all their abilities remain unchanged. Now, any kind of mage or general arcane caster, wizard, sorcerer, warlock, if you're looking at 5th edition, their abilities remain unchanged. There are some exceptions, though. Certain spells are different in space than they would be on the ground. That's something you're going to have to take into account. Other than that, everything works just the same. Priest/clerics We've talked about some of the problems with them when we talked about paladins. The fact that they need an icon or a spell in order to connect to their deity. What they can do that a paladin cannot do is basically form a church in a new plane, in a new sphere. What breaks down here is similar to what we were talking about with the fighter and having followers. You, as a cleric / priest, could effectively form your religion in a sphere, making it have a presence, and then being able to do your spells as normal. It's a process, though. It requires you to have some kind of religious headquarters. This headquarters, wherever you find it, wherever you form it, has to at least have 200 people that are going to be worshipping there. These are the first two things you're going to need: place and people. Next, you have to be a cleric that can at least cast 4th level spells, because you're going to have to be the religious center of this temple, this shrine you're building in space. And effectively, you need that amount of divine power in order to sanctify it. Then you're going to have to spend at least a year in this location, effectively consecrating it to your deity. At that point in time, either you're going to have to stay there and keep it going, or you're going to have to at least have a similar person of similar ability effectively take over as the head person worshipping it in order for it to maintain itself. Now, this doesn't stop you from exploring the rest of this sphere. You can still do that and still be connected to this shrine / temple you formed. It's just the fact is, if you completely leave the sphere, you need at least someone there that could represent you or your deity. But now that you've created this, spent the time, spent the effort, got the people, guess what? Your deity is now connected to this sphere. You can do spells just as normal there. You still can't do it in the Folkestone. Now, the thieves or rogue type classes are again completely unaffected. Space is space. The only thing is, if you tend to be on the negative side of the law, there are places that have laws in space. There are plenty of places that don't. And the fact is, smaller colonies or smaller settlements tend to have less order to them, less law power, so that's actually the kind of places that rogues usually prefer, / thieves, of course. Bards. Bards also are not limited by space. Not at all. Doesn't do anything to them. Bards get along just fine. In fact, they get along probably better than most because of the kind of multicultural nature of space. They get along very fine because bards themselves tend not to be of one culture. They tend to sort of spread out in amongst a bunch of different ones and learn of them. So they work well. And especially if you stay around a sphere for a period of time performing, their names easily spread, and you can get famous pretty rapidly within a certain sphere. Basically, your sphere of influence can grow pretty easily in comparison to, say, perhaps on the ground. Now let's move on, though, and let's talk about something else just a little bit. Alignment. The fact is, alignment exists in space just like it does on a planet. And alignment means pretty much the same thing as it does to you on a planet as it does in space. The big exception is the fact that settlements in space tend not to have an alignment towards good or evil. There we go. So if you're visiting a place in space, it's not really going to be aligned good or evil, more than likely. The people within it are an exception, that they could have those that are that way, but because of the nature of the transitive nature of cultures and such in space, it kind of eliminates that good-evil vibe a lot. And as I said, though, the individuals are complete different, that you could always have plenty of evil individuals or good individuals, especially if you have a large colony. You might have one that the majority of people are good. They really are. But the sheer fact is, the way that the government works there, the way that the city works overall, isn't. And any kind of changes in alignment that might occur to you function just as normal in space as they would on a planet. So you're just affected by your own morality there just as you would be on a planet. But that's it for today. I first went over the changes you're going to have to know about when it comes to playing a character class, in space. Now, I haven't handled every class, because, again, Spelljammer is mostly 2nd edition. And The expansions you can have, though, fit to many other classes that have existed in many other editions. If we look to 5th edition, I didn't directly mention the Sorcerer or Warlock, but they fit exactly in line with a Wizard. A Barbarian fits exactly in line with a Fighter. So does a Monk. You can see that the major changes, of course, are going to be the Divine Casters, which will include Druids, much like Rangers, and then Clerics and Paladins. These changes, though, apply in such a way that they can be overcome if you're at least smart enough and educated enough to do it. Groundling characters might have trouble because they don't know, but it's up to you as the Dungeon Master to actually let them know ahead of time. You don't want to screw them up. You don't want to damage their characters so much. And the changes in spells, well, they'll know their groundling versions of spells, but there will be, if they learn more spells, they might learn spacefaring versions of them. They'll have encounters with it. So it's important to note these changes and know about them. I will be talking about some of them in the episodes upcoming. I finished up today, of course, talking about alignment. Alignment's something that's existed in every edition, and of course it still exists today. And it's important to know about the alignment of a place you're going to. In this case, more than likely it's just going to be lawful. Maybe lawful neutral, maybe just true neutral. Rarely I would call it chaotic neutral. Settlements don't tend to go that direction. But the fact is, good and evil, they aren't the same in space. At least when it comes to societies. Individuals, well, you're normal. In the next episode, I'm going to talk, of course, about proficiencies, what those mean in space, equipment, and magic. But if you have any questions, comments, anything to say, anything think I left out, please leave in the comments below. Please like, share, and subscribe. It's your support for the channel, the empire, the work I do. If you want to show some extra support, you could always check out my Patreon, link in the description below. Regardless, until the next time, I bid you farewell.